Okay, let's get started. So welcome to the second lecture in our series, Machine Learning for Biochemical Application. My name is Aaron Feller. I'll be teaching this section. I'm a second year PhD student in Wilke's lab. I do research with language models on peptides and proteins and work with Brian Davies here on antimicrobial peptides. So today's lecture is going to be a primer on programming with AI assistants. So we're really going to get down to base level. So if you have a background in programming, some of this might be some review. We're going to start at the very bottom. And then hopefully by the end, even if you're experienced, give you some tips and tricks to really improve your workflow. You get going a little bit quicker up and running with programming ML. So in my mind, there are really three steps to a computational project. First step is framing your problem. Second step is setting up your development environment. And within this, there's a few things that we're going to cover today. And this includes what language you want to use, the IDE, package managers, and storage, or how you store your code. And then finally, the final step is code generation and execution of that code. So we're going to do this a little bit out of order. We'll first go through setting up your environment to give everyone a background on how code is run and where you run it. And then we'll jump into some example problems. Show how that works. All right, so in the world of ML, we have specific tools that we use. I've kind of clustered them here. So on the left side, you see Python, Visual Studio Code, and Colab. You may have heard of some of these. We'll get into all these in detail. The top right, Anaconda and GitHub. And then in the bottom here, some AI tools that will explain how to use and show you some workflows. All right, so the first question I feel like a lot of entry programmers have, and I had when I started, is what language to use. And so we use Python for the most part. And so the reason we use Python is that scientific research is often done using Python. So some of those first explorations, building out models for the first time, Python's used most commonly for that. And some of the reason is it's easy to read, learn, and write. So all of us in here are experts in another domain, whether it's microbiology, biochemistry, physics maybe. And we really want to get up and running with programming fast and not spend all the time understanding the architecture deeply. So Python's great for that. There are also diverse packages. So there's a lot of tools you can just grab off the shelf and apply to your data set or your analysis. It's an interpreted language, which means iterations really fast. It's a little bit in the weeds, but essentially you can run code line by line, and it makes debugging a lot faster. I think one of the most important things is there's a large active community of Python programmers. So most of the packages are updated regularly with new features coming out all the time. New packages are coming out that you can run analysis with. And then I think most importantly, Python's simple. So a quick example of this. So in entry-level programming class, the first program you write is the Hello World program. So you get your computer to say Hello World back to you. So if we look across a handful of languages here, in C, about 5 lines. It's a little bit confusing. C++, very similar with an additional line, and Java gets even more complex. When you get to Python, it's a single line. You ask the computer print, and you put in quotes what you'd like printed. Okay, so we're going to work in Python for these reasons, for the simplicity. So let's get into where you run your Python code. We use something called an interactive development environment, an IDE. And so over on the left side, you can see an ancient terminal in a computer. And what we work with today looks more like something on the right side. So there's color coding. There's all these nifty tools and tricks to help debugging and understanding your code or understanding others' code. We'll go into a couple examples of IDEs. So the first one is Visual Studio Code. And there are a lot of options for what IDE you can use. I use Visual Studio Code. I know others do here as well. And it's really great to get up and running. Has a lot of functionality. Easy to understand. So this is like the starting screen when you first install it. It's pretty simple. The next slide I'm going to show you, it'll jump out at you, but it's going to be what it looks like when you're coding. So this is a screenshot from my computer of Visual Studio Code in the midst of a project that I threw together. You can see it's an application you run on your computer. You have your bar at the top, file edit, etc. You have tabs on the left side, and I'm in the directory tab here. In that top left corner, you can see the few files I have in this test directory. Then this one that I have open opens into this panel here, and you can see the code that I've written. And it's color-coded in specific ways, so you can understand strings are in orange, for example, variables in blue, so you can really, at a glance, understand what's happening. And I'll just mention, I think I sent out an email with links, and we also have links on our syllabus page on the website for installing all of this and getting set up. Okay, so this is an IDE that you run on your computer as an application. I'm going to jump into Google Colab. Google Colab is a web-based IDE, which means it runs in your browser. You see at the top, this is a shot from Firefox, but here's the actual URL that I'm running, and it builds this nice environment that looks similar. And really, what Colab's useful for, they have a little highlight in their intro, is that it allows you to write and execute Python code in your browser with zero configuration. You get access to GPUs free of charge and easy sharing. So it's a great resource, right? You can jump in there, write a program, write a short script, send a link to someone else, and they can run your same analysis. Okay, so we have the language Python. Now we have an IDE where we execute our code. So the next thing is, how do we rely on these large databases of code that we can download and use other people's scripts? So this is an example of an introductory ML package ecosystem. Yes. So the question was, what are my thoughts on PyCharm as an IDE? So I work in Visual Studio Code, so I'm going to say it's the best one. I think I downloaded PyCharm when I started working in Python. It was pretty early in my experience, and I couldn't quite figure it out. So for me, VS Code's easier, simpler. There's also a lot of accessibility for running GitHub Copilot, which PyCharm probably has too, connecting through SSH to the cluster or TAC, which I know how to do in VS Code. But yeah, you can find your own and however it works. Okay, so with this ecosystem at the bottom, you can see this is our base language Python. And all these are packages that people have written and published open source, so you can download them for free and use them. And this first layer is sort of data manipulation or data management. So some of these names you'll become familiar with if you kind of enter this space, but pandas is for data representation, data manipulation. NumPy is for doing operations on numerical vectors. And SciPy is for algorithmic programming, mainly done in the science. The second layer here is just a handful of potential ML packages. So starting on the left, scikit-learn is great for simple implementation of kind of basic models to really get started with machine learning. PyTorch allows you to create custom models for specific applications. Lightning kind of builds on top of PyTorch for training procedures and logging your training. And then Transformers is for downloading and running pre-trained models, right? So a model someone else has trained, they have a big repository of those, and you can just pull them into your workspace. Then this last layer is for plotting. So once you've trained a model or you're trying to visualize your data, these are great to get an image of that. Okay, so all these packages you want to work with and apply to your coding pipeline. So how do you get them into your IDE or your environment? So we use something called Package Manager. So this is sort of just to set your vocabulary, but on the left side, we have a virtual environment, which really brings together your Python code with packages that are published open source. And we use PyPy or Python package installer to bring those into that space. And then on the right side, we have Conda. It's has a little bit more controls for version controlling to make sure your environment's set up perfectly. But these are essentially, will create a virtual computer inside your your workspace so that whatever you install into it doesn't interfere with your operating system, or you can set up multiple virtual machines to run separate analyses. Okay, that was a big data dump. How's everyone feeling? Okay, so now we have the full stack of coding. The last thing I'm going to touch on here for some background is where do you put your code once you've written it? So the best practices for code storage today is something called GitHub. I'm sure some of you have heard of this, but essentially it's an online repository for code. So let's say you finish coding for the day, close your laptop, it falls off the back of your bicycle when you're heading home and you lose all that work for the day. This helps avoid that. So essentially you work here in your developer workstation, you write code, maybe fix a bug, add some functionality to something. And at the end of the day, you commit to your local repository, and then you're able to push that to the online code base. What's really cool about this ecosystem is it's built an online research community where with open source code, you can actually pull back from other people's code repositories, bring it to your machine, run their same analysis on your data, right? So you're bringing things into the cloud. You make it public, other people can access your code and run it, and you can dig around in this. So if you're kind of new to this space, I recommend setting up a GitHub account and sort of poking around. Maybe find a paper with an analysis you like. You can download that code and run it locally. All right, so let's get into an example. We're going to solve a toy problem. And we're going to go through a few steps here. So I'm going to first introduce the data set and the goal. Choose a model that achieves this goal we've set for ourselves. We're going to write some Python code, which I've actually pre-written. And we're going to use scikit-learn for this, so some base machine learning model. We'll then plot the training curve with matplotlib. And then at the very end, we'll take our model we've trained and make a prediction on a test set of the data. Just a precursor, we're going to be talking about iris flowers for this. I just want to say toy models are fun because generally when we're doing research, you don't really know where you're ending up. You kind of start an analysis and end up in a cloud somewhere and eventually find your way out to some result. For our toy model, we'll start here and we'll go directly to a perfect solution. Okay, so the data set is from the 1930s. A biologist went out and took flowers from 3 different species of iris. And he measured the length and the width of both the petal and the sepal of these. And alongside that, he had a class label with it of the species of iris. So 3 different classes: Setosa, Versicolor, and Virginica. What we're going to do here is build a model that takes as input the length and width here. And through machine learning, we're going to train it to predict the class label or the species of the flower. Everyone on board? So we have our data set. We have our task laid out for us. So now we need to pick a model. So for this example, we're going to go with a basic feed-forward network. So Clay has mentioned some of these in the last lecture. So this basic model, essentially we have an input layer, 2 hidden layers, and an output layer. So the fully connected means every neuron in a single layer is connected to every neuron in the following layer. Feed forward means the information is only passed in a forward direction. And it's a neural network because we're using neurons. So this is the model we'll use to do our classification task. And this right here is all the code we need to perform this. So it's quite simple, 24 lines. I'll walk through this piece by piece. So the first step is to import those packages. We bring in scikit-learn. We pull in the data set. We pull in a function to split our data into training, which is what the model will see, and the test set, which we'll use for evaluation at the end. We'll import matplotlib for plotting at the very end. And then this final one here is our MLP classifier which is just another name for a feed-forward network. So those are our imports. The next line, we pull in the data set. So create a variable iris, and we use this data set we've imported to load the iris data. We then split that into the independent and dependent variables, so the x and the y. For the independent data will be the measurements done on the flowers, and the dependent are the classes. We then split the data into the train and test sets, right? And you're starting to notice we're running out of code here. So when do we get to machine learning? So the next step here, the classifier, is how we set up our model. So we call MLP classifier, and we pass in a few arguments. So we name our hidden layer sizes, and we have 2 layers of 10 neurons each, what this represents. And then we do a max iteration, so the maximum number of times it'll run through the data. Sure, so MLP is a multi-layer perceptron. The same thing as a feed-forward network. Okay, that's a great question. So the question was, how many hidden layers should we add to our model? I'd say for the most part, this is done through trial and error. So the main method is called a grid search, where you have multiple parameters. Let's say how many layers you want to include and how many neurons per layer. And you'll try sampling across all those variables. So it really is a trial and error process. Okay, so once we have our model set up and the parameters set, then we fit our model to our data. So it's a single line of code. You just put in your X and your Y values. And then this final bit of code will just plot the training procedure. So in, let's see, this is 24 lines of code, where 6 of those are spaces and 6 of those are comments. So in 12 lines of code, we've brought in our data, built a model, and trained it. So the results from this bit of code here, called our training curve. So on the x-axis, we have the iterations, or epochs, as they're called, which is just the number of times we pass through the full data set when training our model. And on the y-axis, we have the loss, which is a calculation of the difference between our model's guess at that stage and the ground truth label. So as we step through iterations of training, we can see our loss decreases quite rapidly and continues to approach 0 until we hit our maximum of 1,000. So now we have a model trained, and now what we can do is take that model and use it to run inference on a data set it has not seen before. Sure. Yes, definitely. So I have this code in a Google Colab notebook that I'll send out at the end of class, so you can play with these parameters and change the numbers. And I just want to point out, this doesn't take a long time. It took 0.7 seconds to run. So you change those numbers, continue running it, so you can get this approved. You could even, grab this code, stick in your own data set that you're interested in using, and apply the same model to that data. Yes. Right. Exactly. So in this case, I'm using the whole data set as a batch. So the model sees the whole data set and calculates the loss across all of it, because there's only 150 flowers data set. So I think, right. So so this calculation, as it's done during training, is on the training set. So you have a validation set, and you'll run a validation step at the end. This is like a simple toy example, and I think in the future lectures, we'll get much more deeply into how to calculate loss, how it's calculated, the equations for that, and kind of best practices in stepping through that. Okay, so we have our trained model, and I just threw in 3 print statements here. The first one prints our true label. Second one prints our predicted label from our model from this test set here. And then the third one prints the success rate. So like I said, simple model, toy example. You can see the true labels are here. So these are classes of your 3 different flower types, 0, 1, and 2. And our predicted labels are exactly the same, so we nailed it 100%. Okay, so I have a secret. So with this model, I didn't write any of the code. I didn't find it on Google and copy and paste it. I used an AI assistant to build this whole bit of code for me. So next, I'm going to go through a little bit of using AI to really speed your time up on producing valuable code and getting through your analysis. So one example we're going to go through is GitHub Copilot. So this is an AI system trained in the same way ChatGPT is trained. So they take in a whole bunch of public code on GitHub and other online resources. They train a model called the OpenAI Codex model, and then that gets deployed to this GitHub Copilot service. And what this does is as you're coding, it'll provide suggestions for line completion, right? So in the middle of your text, it'll give you a suggestion, sort of like autocomplete on your cell phone. And this takes in context of everything you've written in your repository, previous lines of code in the text. And I see Clay smiling at me. I think I'm going into too much depth, but essentially it provides suggestions and allows you to get to a finished product much quicker. So I'll run through an example of this. So this is a coding quiz from the website Rosalind. I see Ed's here. He's going to hate me for this. Ed teaches advanced programming class for our department. So this is a simple example of how do we count nucleotides in a sequence, right? And I'll skip all of this text, but essentially you're given a DNA string of length at most 1,000 nucleotides. And it wants us to return 4 integers or 4 numbers that count the respective number of times that the symbols A, C, G, and T occur in this sequence. Okay, so here's a sample string of DNA. And so all I do to get to the solution for this is I take all this text, copy it, I paste it into my IDE, and I can everything that's just text, I put the hashtag in front of it, and that means it won't be read and processed as code. Sort of just like a note there for us. But with GitHub Copilot, it'll read all this text. And you can see this gray at the bottom is actually what it's suggesting for the next line of code. So this says DEF, which is how you define a function, and then it's named count nucleotide. You just press tab, finishes it for you, and actually makes the next suggestion. It wants to finish the whole function. So you press tab again, fills that in. And now it wants to run our function on our data set S, press tab again. And then we run this code and we get to the solution. 2012, 17, 21, which you can see matches our sample output here. Right, so I didn't write a single line of code, copy pasted, and it did the work for me. I have to warn you, this is a very simple example. This won't solve, really extensive problems. You should always understand what's happening with the code to make sure that it's working correctly. But as far as, if you're day in, day out doing this sort of work, it can really speed up your process. It makes programming feel less like this mathematical, logical operation and more sort of creative, where you have an idea, you can implement it quickly and start testing. All right, so I'm going to go into one more example. So ChatGPT, we all know what ChatGPT is. Does everyone know what ChatGPT is? I mean, it's all the rage. It's essentially a chat bot, if you will, a large language model where you can query it, deep understanding of human language. It also has deep understanding of code because it's read so much on the internet. Like you can use it, let's say you have like the leftover ingredients in your fridge, you haven't gone shopping in a while. You can type all those ingredients in and it'll design a classy French meal that you then have to cook.